Today, Ed Saltzman, who is president of Defined Health, will present Establishing Proof of Relevance for Early-Stage Deal-Making. Defined Health is a leading asset development strategy firm for the biopharmaceutical industry. Our clients include 13 of the top 20 pharma and 6 of the top 10 biotechs, as well as scores of pre-commercial biotechs developing compounds and platform technologies. We bring to our clients a unique perspective grown over 30 years of evaluating pipeline and inline opportunities by bridging our knowledge of drug development, business development, and commercial strategy across multiple therapeutic categories and technology platforms. We're pleased to present our Insight Series webinars as a way of showcasing how we view and think looking forward about various critically relevant topics for the biopharmaceutical industry. To learn more about Defined Health, our capabilities, and our upcoming annual Therapeutic Insight and Cancer Progress conferences, please visit our website at definedhealth.com or send us an email or give us a call. We'll be happy to tell you more. I want to just cover a couple of quick housekeeping notes. Today's slides and an audio-visual version of today's talk will be up on our website shortly. Previous versions of this talk are already on the website. We should have time for questions at the end of Ed's presentation. Please send them along while you think of them, so we'll be ready to kick off a Q&A session when we get done. And of course, if we don't get to all your questions, we'll follow up with you in the next day or so. Thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Ed.
Hello, everyone. Hello out there in the virtual world. I realize that one thing I should start off by doing is to wish you either a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening, depending on what time zone you are listening in. And we do have multiple time zones represented, which is terrific. There's a terrific audience out there of well over 100 or more of you who've registered, so I'm delighted you're out there. I'm saying hello virtually. I did get a quick glance at the list a little earlier, and I saw a lot of familiar faces, but also some new people. So as Ginny just indicated, there should be plenty of time at the end for some engaging dialogue around some of the issues I raised today, and I hope we can do that. Okay, so before I start, I just want to, I should note that today has been a pretty newsy day in the pharma industry. In addition to the ever-present rumors that Pfizer and AstraZeneca are about to do another colossal mega merger, and some people would probably say it was colossally ill-advised, but nevertheless, these things are going to continue to happen. We've probably been blessed that not that many have happened over the last few years. It looks like Valiant is going to make a hostile run at Allergan, which should be very, very interesting to watch. And of particular interest was the news today about Novartis and GSK doing a bit of a baseball trade on oncology assets, their over-the-counter businesses. That is at least a little more creative and interesting, and maybe a mutual win-win. We'll see how that shakes out over time, but clearly there's a lot of news. What I want to try to make clear to you is that none of this changes the need for innovation. My talk is about innovation, but more specifically what it's about is about challenging some long-standing conventional wisdom about what drives value in innovative programs, in innovative companies. Because the question of how to value innovation is at the center of what we do here and the center of what I know a lot of you struggle with in your day-to-day activities. So I'm going to start by telling you that over a 30-year perspective, as Ginny indicated before, we have never seen a time, and this includes the time during the pre-genomic bubble days, where so much conventional wisdom about that has been extremely long-standing about what drives value in drug discovery and development is on the cusp of change. So the slide that you see in front of you now is indeed the long-standing conventional wisdom. This wisdom was actually presented probably earlier than 1997. The earliest reference I could find was in 1997. This is out of Burrell and Ernst & Young. And basically, as you can see, what this essentially says is this is where the big inflection points are today. Those inflection points were considered to be pretty much sacred for many years before that, for many years after. And to a lot of people who haven't been paying attention, they still are the inflection points today. While I'm not telling you that that is no longer an inflection point, I think I'm going to make it clear that a new inflection point that opens up a lot of attractive avenues for innovation, for deal making, for financing of early stage companies has all started to coalesce together at a very, very good time. And importantly, no matter what happens in the IPO market, this is probably a trend that is here for the foreseeable future. So I think we need to reconsider what you just saw on that previous slide. Here is the first slice of data that's going to tell you that a change is not only in the air, the change has already occurred. It started somewhere around 2011, but really gained a lot of traction and a lot of speed in 2012. So what you see in the shaded rows in this chart are actually the largest deals of the chart is actually of the largest deals done in 2012, largest licensing deals done in 2012. The shaded ones are deals in which no program had entered the clinic at the time the deal was done. Okay, I want to repeat that. No program had entered the clinic. So for those of you who are immediately sort of a bit jaded about seeing headlines and BioWorld dollars, I direct you to the right column, which is immediately to the right of the column to its left, which has the headline value. But if you look to the right, the upfront payments in many of these deals have become increasingly meaningful. Okay, remember, these are programs that never hit the clinic. If you go down to 2013, if you go back to 2013, just 1 year, this accelerated more. This is probably a little easier view to see this. But if you look at the top licensing deals in 2013 again, not only have many of the deals not had a program reach the clinic, we don't even have a lead. We are not at the IND stage, and yet we are not uncommonly seeing upfront payments in the range of $60 million, $30 million, $17 million. This is unprecedented for deals at this stage. It is precedented for deals where for a brief period of time, sometime around 2006 or 2007, we started to see what was called the $50 million IND. That was a trend that didn't last. But if you actually look at what's going on at the early stages in these deals, you will see quite conclusively that the upfront payments have, as I said, started to become something you need to pay serious attention to, whether you're a buyer or a seller. We've been paying attention to this for a long time, but back in 2010, we actually predicted what would happen today. I'm not sure how many of people were listening, but we actually put this prediction out. And the prediction, which I gave in several talks at the time, in which we tried to get out, was that pharma is going to need to step up and pay more for early stage programs for a very, very, very simple fact. And the simple fact was this, because pharma, starting around 2010, started putting the brakes on internal discovery. So when pharma started cutting, and you started seeing the announcements around 2008, 2009, the first targets were SG&A. R&D was always still considered sacred. 2010 was the watershed year in which major discovery operations started to be shuttered, and pharma moved out of, the largest pharma companies really, really focused their discovery efforts on an extremely limited number of therapeutic programs and areas. And that is a permanent change. So AstraZeneca began this in 2010. Again, 1,800 jobs went in R&D. Pfizer, okay, basically concluded something that some other people probably thought earlier, was that its research hadn't been worth the historic high levels of investment. Some people would consider that an understatement, but the reality was, there it was, okay? So it was pretty easy if you were looking at this and saying, well, pharma's cutting discovery, what are they going to do about an early stage pipeline? So what we did was we went to evaluate pharma and queried to try to find out the number of programs in any year and who were the top 10 pharma companies in those years that had programs, the number of programs that were in the pipelines reported to be in preclinical or phase 1 development. And voila, not surprisingly, the preclinical pipeline started to shrink. Okay, now, you could argue, as pharma does frequently, and sometimes to some degree impressively, that they've been a lot more selective. But the reality is that what this really reflects is a decline in internal discovery investment. And as pharma started to finally think about a world past the patent cliff, it was quite apparent even back in 2010 that while they wouldn't deal with it then, starting around 2012, 2013, or where we are now in 2014, this trend would accelerate, and this is what we're seeing. Now, all of that was easily predictable. Here is what stunned me, and I think it stunned, if you're not aware of this, this may actually stun a lot of you, which is that there's, at the same time, we've had this enormous increase in early stage deal valuations, including non-contingent upfront payments. We've had actually a decline in upfront payments in clinical stage deals, anywhere from phase 1 to phase 3, declines in upfront payments. We've also seen more or less, okay, some of these data are adjusted for the outliers, which inevitably can serve to contaminate some of these analyses. So you'll see some notes if you look very carefully on the bottom about the deals that needed to be taken out of here. But if you look at the overall adjusted trend, what you see is a steady erosion in both upfront payments and deal values by therapy area, almost regardless of therapeutic area. So those of you who are thinking about oncology, cast your eyes over to the oncology upfront payments and notice that those have declined. Notice the total deal values. By the way, the ends of these deals, which you may be wondering about, were relatively consistent year after year and are not a confounding factor in these data. It's not explainable because pharma hasn't fixed its little CAGR problem. Little CAGR, I choose that word deliberately, little CAGR. There is little compound annual growth forecast in the pharma world, which is why you see two of those companies who are almost the most deep in the red, AstraZeneca and Pfizer, talking about getting together. Lilly might be talking with Merck. Who knows? Okay, but the reality here is that pharma did not fix its innovation problem, did not fix its near-term problem, and while investing in early-stage discovery may be an attempt to address its long-term problem, it's a bit of a head-scratcher to understand why they are passing over the clinical stage asset inventory. With respect to the asset inventory, it's relatively robust. Now, robust in terms of inventory, which means quantity. Quality may be a different issue, and that's something we can discuss and we will continue to discuss. It informs some of the work we do around here every day. But what you will actually see in this analysis is actually quite a few hours, in fact, probably days of work done by the very kind people over at Thompson Pharma Cortellis, Mark Gordon's group over there, who every year very graciously honor a request to go in and do a custom analysis. What I wondered, starting a few years ago, was how many programs were out there in the pipelines of biotechnology companies that would conceivably be seeking partners. Why would one be seeking a partner? Well, the fundamental reason one seeks a partner, as we all know, is capital. Okay? All the other things sort of fall in line after that, but without the capital, the deal makes no sense. So as you started to see a big increase in the number of these programs that entered into the clinic, okay, starting around 2009 and 2010, part of that was pushed by pharma. Part of it was pushed by long-standing, as I started this presentation by observing, long-standing conventional wisdom about how you inflected value and how VCs thought that value should be inflected or would be inflected. But nevertheless, as you went up the line of these programs, what you saw pretty consistently was the fact that all of these programs increased every year, but they were in companies. They were in companies that presumably would want a deal because they weren't generating revenues from a commercialized product. So that's the meaning of this chart. It's not all the products that are in biotech, because if they're in the pipeline of Biogen IDEC, they're not on here. If they're in the pipeline of Gilead, they're not on here. Okay? But if they're in the pipeline of either a public-backed or a venture-backed, pre-commercial, early stage, but clinical stage company, they should be represented on this chart. So the inventory for pharma companies to go out and pick some of this fruit ought to be fairly robust. Okay? Now, you could argue that there may be a little supply and demand issue, which is depressing valuations. I don't necessarily dispute that, but that does not explain why, with so many interesting assets out there, pharma's just not buying. And when they are buying, they're paying a lot less. And the fact that they're not buying is amply demonstrated by this analysis, which basically takes all the programs that you saw in the last one and then sort of, divides it into the number of actual deals, or divides the deals by the programs, depending on how you want to look at it. And basically then roughly computes that if you were a seller, and we assumed you were a seller if you were not achieving any money anyway except either public or private investment dollars, if you were looking for a pharma partner, and I realize there are exceptions, there are rare disease companies, there are companies going all the way to the market, so we don't necessarily have to talk about that. These are all aggregated data. But it didn't look like your chances, assuming all of those companies did want deals, were very, very good. Okay? Now, they went up a little bit in 2013, and that may be a reflection of the fact that pharma is going to step up and be a little more aggressive around these clinical stage assets, but I would be a little bit dubious about that, and we'll get to that in a minute. Part of the reason is that pharma has been really good at licensing and business development over the last 5 years. Over the last 5 years, commensurate with the decline in internal discovery and the virtual disappearance of something that used to be known as not invented here, pharma has become efficient and machine-like in its ability, and I'm talking about the large pharmas here, in its ability to identify and source the assets they would like to have, they would like to own. Whether they're always right or not is a diligence discussion, and it's one that time will tell, but they've been very good at deciding what they want, creating their shopping list, going out and finding it, and actually buying it. Okay? So a lot of what they wanted for a really long time was this idea of this post-proof of concept program, the traditional value inflection point. This was the low-hanging fruit. Just a couple of examples here, but I probably couldn't fill more than 2 or 3 slides with these headlines. Okay? That's how relatively few there were left that had progressed to this new pharma sweet spot, which moved from, as many of you who have been doing this for as long as I have, used to be in phase 3 in a bygone day, and then moved back to the robust phase 2B. So there's the ones that are no longer there. What is actually, to understand what actually is happening, and again, I think it's still a head scratcher, and I'm not claiming to know the answers, but I'm claiming to, I will give you the benefit of some of my thoughts I've had as I go through this, and reflecting on some of the things we've learned in our day-to-day activities. There are some things about the pharmaceutical industry that have not changed in the 30 years I've been involved in it. And one of this is that it's an incredibly capital-intensive business. It is a very risky business, albeit one would argue that the risk has gone up immeasurably, or almost immeasurably, certainly over the last 10 and maybe over the last 5 years. But the main thing is that it takes a lot of money and a lot of time to bring a new molecular entity to the market. So just to have some fun, because there are all these debates around how much it actually costs, what we did was we aggregated on one slide the ones starting in 1979, ranging through 2012. Some of them that were published in 2000, representing a 2-year time frame, are greater than they are today, all using different methodologies. So you can conclude nothing except that it's not cheap. Here's what's changed, though. This is the thing that has changed. What has changed is that, and this is a graphical depiction of your pharmaceutical detail rep, perhaps your regional manager, perhaps your head of sales. There's your VP of sales, who is putting the strategy in with the megaphone to basically get the largest share of voice. And there's, unfortunately, what happens when all you compete on is share of voice, especially when you're in a difficult generic category. What I've concluded is that the only thing that's really changed, that is a fundamental, foundational change in this business that will withstand all the trends, all the up and downs, all the buzzwords, is commercial risk is already off the charts. Now, while I looked very carefully, but only once to see who was on the call, with as many people as signed up for this call, I apologize in advance if one of the people or more were associated with the launch of any of these drugs, or perhaps in-licensed any of these drugs, okay? And this is not to pick on any of these things, but these are drugs, and by the way, I didn't call them disasters. This was reported in Fierce Pharma. But the definition of disaster was variable. What was common was all of these programs greatly underperformed analyst expectations, greatly, to some case almost incredibly. So yeah, not all to the same degree, but obviously this is the top 10. There are many more if you wanted to bring it to 15 or 20. So it's sort of this good news and bad news. This good news is pharma is launching more products. The bad news is that they're not selling them. So what does that have to do with this idea that the clinical stage inventory is not generating substantial value inflection in the deal space, even some of the programs that are coming up through phase 2 and are either close or have achieved proof of concept? What is the reason? Again, I'm only going through my forensics here. I don't know. It'd be interesting to hear what some of you think, but I'll tell you what my sort of, beginning forensics are sort of telling me. One thing they're telling me is that the green that you see, depending on the quality of your monitor, the green that you see beginning in 2009, which was an order of magnitude higher than it has been at any time in history, were financial discontinuations. Again, reported reasons that pharma companies, okay, in surveys, told surveyors that the products that they killed, the reason that they were killed. So you see a shift in time. This is an amazing chart because, as you can see, as with the investment, in novelty, which began in the last decade, increased in the earlier part of this decade, and you start to see more programs failing because of efficacy. You see some increase in the ones failing because of adverse events, and then all of a sudden you wake up from a long nap, and in 2008 beginning and 2009, whoa, there are a lot of programs being continued or discontinued for financial reasons. Now, when would you know that you could discontinue a program for financial reasons? If financial reasons means it is unlikely to get anywhere near its revenue expectations or generate positive net present value, then I would submit to you the time you probably know the best is sometime around phase 2, where you've got a target product profile to wrestle with. You can think through the various challenges associated with commercializing the drug. And if you look at the phase 2 discontinuations, which are not on this chart, but if I superimpose them, those also peaked right around the same time, around 2009. The phase 2 discontinuation rate hit about 70%, okay, with the vast majority presumably being driven by this major increase in financial discontinuations. Take home was, drug works, we won't be able to sell it, or at least sell enough of it to make it worthwhile to take it to phase 3. Okay, so when I think about what's going on in the clinical stage inventory, this tells me more than I need to know, at least for the time being, that pharma had an internal inventory problem with the quality of its assets. So this idea that we want to inflect value on clinical stage assets, okay, is not a simple discussion. It's not one that you can do in even a well thought out webinar. And I hope you all think this is a well thought out webinar. But this idea that when both the commercial and scientific risk in a program or a platform or sort of de-risk simultaneously is where we're seeing the biggest traction in terms of deals. But I'm going to go back to this for just a minute, because I think what is actually causing the decline in clinical stage deal values is it's not the lack of inventory. It's not necessarily supply and demand. It's not the fact that there are fewer deals. It's just that there are less valuable deals. What's causing this decline is that the available inventory that I shared with you a few slides ago don't look any better in terms of this balance of commercial and scientific risk than the current inventory that pharma has been discontinuing for financial reasons. That's the cusp of the problem. Now, if I've correctly identified the problem, it probably has some pretty significant implications for your deal strategy, especially if you are a seller. And that's because as I look at the deal data and I look at the deals, and having been involved with more than a number of these from a strategic, not a transactional sense, but from a strategic perspective at Defined Health, I can tell you that the net present value perceived by pharma companies appears to be greatest when you've achieved this sort of perfect Zen balance between the two things that you don't want to have. You don't want to have commercial risk and you don't want to have scientific risk. So when you see these eye-popping deals, you see these pharmacyclics-like deals, you see deals that are actually done at that point where the commercial risk looks manageable and the scientific risk looks to be de-risked, which is those phase 2B deals that we talked about before. But because there are so few of those deals, pharma has to pick. They have to pick because they picked all that low-hanging fruit already. And there are relatively few to none of those programs left. So what's gone on here is that pharma's had to make a choice. And the choice that pharma has clearly made, and this is sort of the second conclusion of looking at the data, what I come to is they said pharma is saying, we will not tolerate any commercial risk. And I don't need the data to tell me this. My clients tell me this. Our clients tell me this. So the fact that pharma has agreed to say, I'll take some scientific risk, but you better bring me a commercial profile of something that I'm going to be able to sell, not today, because this takes a long time and that hasn't changed, but in the future environment in which we're heading into. And that is probably the biggest change that's in terms of what's going on out there. So you can do this. If you are an early stage company, you can achieve this sort of not Zen balance, because by definition you will have not de-risked scientifically. You're not going to de-risk scientifically fully until you've achieved proof of concept. But you can de-risk commercially at an early stage. And it's not only possible to do that, it's actually essential for you to do that today before you think about bringing any program to clinical development. And if you've already, unfortunately, brought those programs to clinical development, and you haven't wrestled with this and you haven't done it, you're facing a pretty stark choice. You're either going to have to do it, or you probably should not be spending money on the program. At least that's what the data are telling us. And that's because the perception of commercial risk now exists as the most significant cause of NPV destruction, significant cause of value destruction. And pharma will sit and shoot holes at this at the table continuously, often, and probably for the foreseeable future. What does that mean? And here's sort of the punchline. That means that that chart that we started with a really long time ago, where we said this long-standing value inflection, and here it is in another graphic. You could see all the way to the left. Oh, wait, we drew that for you. You could actually see what used to be called the Valley of Death, the old Valley of Death, or some VCs called it the black box, which is I'm spending and spending and spending, but I'm not really inflecting any value until I take it to phase 2 and get the proof of concept that if I get it to phase 3 in the market, then it's off the charts. Now, you got to be visually astute to sort of understand this because it doesn't look that dramatic, which is why we drew the line there. But if you look early back at that preclinical, okay, you see it actually starts a little lower, but you actually see that the increase there, okay, proportionally, while not being nearly as impressive as it is in the traditional later value inflection stages, but again, looks like even those have flattened out a little bit, okay. And again, this is our illustrative schematic based on the data. So there's no hard number crunching, but this does fairly reflect what's going on in the environment today. You can see that moving something from the early stage to preclinical to IND up to being ready for phase 1 now looks like a much sharper, smaller kind of hockey stick than it ever did before. So all the data points this way. So rather than, bore you with going through all the details of this data, you will have all this data. It's available on our website. This is courtesy of Thomson Reuters, once again. But what you will see here is that if you look at the discovery deals in 2013, it's another way of looking at it, and you look at the average deal value, and look at the way that deal value moved between, again, the bars are the number of deals. If you look at the way the deal value moved in that sort of goldish orange line between the discovery up to the lead or preclinical, that tells you something. If you look at the way the median deal value, it probably doesn't tell you quite as much, and we did have to remove some outliers, or at least our friends at Thomson Reuters did appropriately remove some outliers. The real disturbing part of this trend is that it basically says, I'm not sure why anybody is going to phase 1 unless they plan to go a lot further than that. So we've kind of forensically identified the new value of death here, which is taking a program into the clinic without any plan to know how much you're going to take it further or how you are going to commercially differentiate that program ultimately for a pharma partner or, frankly, on your own. Okay? If you actually look at the median upfront payments by stage of development, again, you see pretty much the same thing, and this is, again, just both product and platform deals. So you're actually seeing, pretty much the same trend. You're seeing that these deals, if you look at the deals, collected, the ones in 2013 operate at a higher plateau, okay? The value inflection doesn't look as sharp, but again, it's not really, at this point, with all the money that's going in to bring a program to the clinic, you're not really inflicting any return on that until you've gone through phase 2. So I have a couple of examples, in addition to just data, and going over this data and saying, well, what does it mean? I scratch my head sometimes at the news, but sometimes I don't scratch my head. Sometimes I read the news and go, there you go. So here, these are the there you go sort of things. But this is, before I get into the examples, and these are going to be a couple of examples of this concept that we coined here back in 2009, which you've all heard a lot of times, called proof of relevance. The most important thing you need to know is you did hear it here first, okay? But you heard it here first because of our daily activity and because we saw too many programs that had achieved proof of concept, but which were therapeutically and therefore commercially irrelevant. So they just did not achieve enough differentiation. In my view, the programs that pharma cut for financial reason and are not licensing at the clinical stage in the available inventory from biotech have not achieved proof of relevance, at least not yet. So here's a couple of examples of the winners, of the ones who did, okay, who have taken very risky programs. I've only taken a couple of examples. Here's Trevena's deal with Forest, okay, with $60 million, okay, bankrolling another venture round, which is a very interesting, a $30 million upfront investment for a total of $90 million in here, which is not a bad deal in an area called acute heart failure, where everything has failed. I mean, failure here is 100%. It's absolutely perfect. So the other point, which you'll see in red on the slide, is that this drug is not in phase 2B. It has headed to phase 2B. So your take-home from this slide is that 5 years ago, this deal would have never happened. Forest, of all companies, would have not have touched this deal in an area. Forest is a company that is probably emblematic of the company that was most willing to embrace commercial risk and most abhorrent of scientific risk. So if you look at this deal in Forest, and you look at the relatively large upfront commitment in an indication in which nothing has succeeded, if that doesn't give you the idea that the winds of change are afoot, I probably can't convince you, okay? So listen to David Solomon at Forest. So what he says, we're investing because there's no material change in the standard of care for patients with acute decompensated heart failure for decades. Antibiotics. This is an area that pharma has shunned for years. All of a sudden, pharma is back, but they're back with novelty because we need novel antibiotics because we have nasty drug-resistant bugs. So we need those drugs. But right now, again, I'm bringing you the fact that this was up to a phase 2 program. This program did not enter phase 2, okay? Well, it just did actually enter phase 2 at the time this deal was done in November of last year, okay? So listen to the head of infectious diseases discovery in PRED at Roche, okay? Not only is it an urgent demand, but this is a novel mechanism. Well, it's great that it's a novel mechanism, but the fact that it's a novel mechanism means that the scientific risk is still out there. So again, we have not de-risked this scientifically, okay? But the commercial risk is probably non-existent or relatively non-existent. So here's another example of pharma at the clinical stage, picking off assets. Again, they're not doing a lot of deals, and they're not doing for a lot of money, so I'm bringing you some of the outliers of people who have succeeded. Okay. Here's one from a company that I never heard of until I saw this, and I still have trouble pronouncing. Glicknick. Tried saying that 10 times fast without stopping. But here's a recombinant Fc fusion protein that could conceivably one day, if you believe in the potential and the promise and you're willing to accept the risk, it can replace intravenous immune globulin. Pretty incredible, knowing all the issues that we know about all the therapeutic uses of IVIG and how darn expensive it is to both make and to pay for. Okay, so the commercial case here is clearly compelling, but the data on which this deal was done, okay, $25 million, which I realize is petty cash for Pfizer, so we don't need to be, going back and forth about that. But my point is Pfizer wasn't doing these deals. They weren't doing these deals, and walking in and getting $25 million when you barely have phase 1 data is a pretty impressive accomplishment by this company called Glicknick. If you want to go a little earlier and understand what is driving proof of relevance at the preclinical stage, you can look at Sangamo's deal. When I gave this talk a little while ago at BioEurope Spring in Europe, it was prior to a panel in which Biogen was represented by John McDonald, who runs their one of the people who runs their business development activities over there, and he talked lovingly of this deal, lovingly of the fact that they were able to step up and pay what was $20 million for something that is not been proven to work, okay, and may take a long time that it's proven to work. But what John made very clear is that if it does work, there won't be a lot of argument about commercial potential, about reimbursability, and about your ability to sell and bring that product to patients, okay? Life-changing clinical benefit. Here's a deal that is actually kind of interesting to me too. I included this because Peter Ziegler, who runs Abbott's early stage deal-making activities, was on the panel as well. So I included this, but my point here is, again, okay, Abbott investing very, very early, okay, in discovery on cystic fibrosis, and I understand that what Vertex has done has to some degree increased the promise and perhaps offset some of the risk in the space, but these are still risky early stage programs with very, very impressive upfront valuations. So the title of this talk had something to do with demonstrating POR early in development, early in the programs. This is something that, to me, is the center of how you capture value from innovation at an early stage. Whether you are planning to take the innovation to the market all the way yourself, whether you're planning to partner it, is not especially relevant, but because most of the programs that will get to the market will, by definition, be partnered eventually, because that foundational thing is probably not going to change all that much, at least, despite all the success in rare disease. Demonstrating POR will, in fact, inflect significant value. I should change that to will, prior to clinical proof of concept or prior to clinical development. The real issue is, what is it? Okay. So I'm going to conclude with just a couple of thoughts about what this is, what this stuff is, because I have tried, so I've done quantitative forensics, but I've also done qualitative forensics. I've sat and interrogated senior BD executives in pharma, senior R&D executives in pharma, after a lot of these deals, and asked them the question that you were all dying to ask: how could you? Why did you? What got you so excited? Okay, what was, and with the very important caveat that we are not, in most of these cases, under confidentiality, nor are you, unless you were under that hint. It's sort of hard to evaluate it. But here's what I've taken in what is sometimes these very difficult discussions, and this clearly was a theme that emerged during the panel I led at BioYear of Spring. Okay, first and foremost, come in with data about biological relevance. Okay, and that doesn't necessarily mean you fully understand the biology of a disease. The fact that many of these diseases remain scourges of humanity turns out to be because we're not as smart as the biology as we thought we were. However, when we talk about biological relevance, what I really am saying, what I'm really trying to get, is that you have a hypothesis. Show that your drug is relevant to that hypothesis, that you're active in that pathway, that you engage that target, okay? And that target somehow, based on the understanding that you have, although it is still scientifically risky as all get out, it could very well be highly relevant to the progression or the consequences or the etiology of the disease you have in mind. That's what I call biological relevance. A well-supported or compelling target product profile. This thing of TPP, this thing that we at Defined Health wrestle with day in and day out, okay? This thing that I'm calling an iterative process, where we go out to KOLs, we come back, we say what we're thinking isn't good enough, we go out to additional physicians, we come back, we go out to payers, we come back and we say, this isn't good enough, this may need to be better, you may need to fine-tune this. That's okay. It's kind of like an adaptive clinical trial. We need adaptive TPPs, okay? But that TPP, the key word in that TPP, the key abbreviation is T for target, okay? Have that target well, just like you have your biological target. Have your commercial target well understood. And that means, when I come to this other point, this well-supported argument for the commercial value. If you achieve that target, you found the patient population. You found the patient population in which the profile that you are arguing is worth further investment, is so clearly differentiated that you can support the value, even if you haven't proven that it works yet. You haven't taken the risk out of that, that pre-proof of concept era that you're, environment that you're operating in. Okay, there's a couple of ways to do this. If you can identify a specific target segment that has clear unmet need within a larger patient population that may be well served, one way to do it. And obviously, if you do this with a biomarker, right today in pharma, just talking to the companies, you get to the front of the queue really, really quickly. Question I asked at BioEurope Spring was, are you guys up here in the pharma world who are somewhat capital comfortable versus those on the other side, are you willing to work with, to roll up your sleeves and work with the innovators to develop these biomarkers? The answer I got, at least that's what they told me, was a resounding yes. So importantly, maybe you don't have to necessarily develop your own biomarker, but if you don't appreciate the need for it, then you haven't showed up at too many pharmaceutical companies lately. That is the end of the formal presentation I have. This slide will just refer to the fact that I like to call this, we're hardly ever in the office slide, how do we do our work? But we have enough people so that we can be out there up and around and seeing you at a variety of important conferences. And I want to clearly make sure, if Ginny, that she may have mentioned, but I want to re-mention, although it's quite some time in the future, our 26th Annual Cancer Progress Conference in New York in March, and our Therapeutic Insight panels, which will be in Paris, France during BioEurope Spring, also in March. March is a busy month for us around here. So, but in every day, we are busy wrestling with the issues that I've raised during this presentation today, okay, helping companies add value to their assets. And I think in summary, the idea that we have changed the point of value inflection, perhaps semi-permanently, I hate to declare anything permanent, is a really foundational change in this industry that needs to be grappled with ASAP, if it hasn't already, across your platforms and development programs, regardless of whether you are a buyer or seller. So with that, I'll open it to questions, and thank you very, very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ed. I have had a couple of questions come in while you were speaking, and they're sort of data intensive, and so I don't want to try to get into them now because we'll have to look back into the data. But we did have one that came in earlier, and I hope you've answered this question by now, but maybe you want to take a moment and specifically articulate it. Someone from a pre-revenue stage biotech company asked what the difference is between proof of relevance and proof of concept from a practical standpoint.
Yeah, and thank you for that question. And again, to Ginny's point, that question did come in prior to the presentation, and when I had heard it before, I said, that's perfect. That's the whole thesis of my presentation. Now, again, if that hasn't answered the question, we can spend a lot more time talking about it. Okay, one thing for sure that's going to change the difference between proof of relevance and proof of concept really depends on the therapeutic category. This is extremely therapeutic category dependent. In oncology, for example, it may be quite relevant. You may have achieved proof of relevance by simply showing that a molecule is active, by simply putting it in humans and showing that you have activity. Okay? And if you can show in a small number of patients with the disease that you're shrinking tumors, despite the fact that you are not in a controlled world, despite the fact that you may have an investigator-initiated study, which can tend to be somewhat contaminated, despite the fact that your N is 6, you may have proof of relevance depending on the cancer that you're in. On the other hand, if you are in the cardiovascular market and you are attempting to launch a therapy to be used on top of a fully genericized or an almost fully genericized class of drugs called statins, your proof of relevance moment may come much further, and it may indeed intersect with proof of concept. So when proof of relevance can be achieved, probably more than anything else, has to do with the therapeutic area and the specific disease. Okay.
And you kind of just answered partially this question, but maybe it's a bit of a bit long-winded. But given that the oncology drug deal-making space has been around early mechanisms of action and hot target areas driven by the high unmet needs, Does the new trend for programs outside of cancer inherently align more with high unmet need areas? And if so, does this reflect a more fundamental trend around focusing on more important disease settings?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Again, I think I think we're kind of playing Pharma Jeopardy here, right? So I think I gave the answer to that question to some degree in answering the other question, or at least I tried. Again, I think that as the commercial bar, so the commercial bar in oncology, in my view, and oncology is our largest therapeutic area, but my view isn't necessarily nearly as informed as Jeff Bachman and Mike Rice, who lead our practice in that area. But I would have to tell you from my flying overview that all the wins. I moderated a panel at Cancer Progress that had Peter Bach from Sloan Kettering on it, the new incoming head of NICE, and the new incoming head of ASCO. And it was all about access and discussion of cancer drug pricing. And I can pretty much tell you the winds of change are there. The commercial risk is high. It is going to get higher. There's been an incredible coverage in BioCentury about this over the last couple of weeks. And that's a sound out for what is a consistently great publication. That's very helpful to me. But I do think it's going to be, oncology is going to start to look more like the other therapeutic areas, rather than the other therapeutic areas are going to start to look more like oncology. Simply because as we continue to advance the standard of care, and as that standard of care becomes more entrenched, it becomes more generic, and therefore becomes less expensive, the bar will be higher. We will be focusing more on intractable diseases or intractable populations with large diseases, and those things very often get confused. But when we're focusing on that, clearly we're going to be able to achieve proof of relevance somewhat like oncology, where we're going to be able to achieve it earlier.
Thank you, and I think we have one more that can be answered over the phone, which is the term lean startup. I have not heard myself, is a principle that's currently used in the tech world, indicating a need to know your customer before investing large sums. In the biotech world, it seems to me clearly knowing your quote-unquote unmet medical need from a commercial standpoint, despite the technical scientific risks. Do you have any comments?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. And again, lean startup is a, I think we use the term capital efficient in our biotech world, and maybe they're the same thing. But I think this is somewhat of a metaphorical observation here, and if I'm reading that correctly as a metaphorical observation, I would simply say that is absolutely correct. Okay, so my only comment is, yeah, I mean that's the conclusion. I believe that it seems somewhat obvious to say to clearly understand the unmet medical need from a commercial standpoint, despite the technical scientific risk, as the person posing the question has asked, would seem obvious. But it is every day around here, and every day in my career, I have found out that it is not very obvious. There is one question that I actually see flashing by that I would like to make sure is clear, and I want to answer it to some degree in the order that they came in. The question, I'll read this one. Interesting that the ones you gave, I think these are examples of POR, are in non-oncology indications. Any examples you can provide in area of oncology? That's a great question, and it's one that, as Jeff Bachman knows and Mike Rice knows from our cancer practice, I'm engaging with them all the time to look for good examples. Perhaps they can follow up with you on some good examples, but I would sort of observe that the vast majority of deals done in oncology are proof of relevance deals. The vast majority of deals are done based on criteria I showed before, that you either have a biological hypothesis and that your drug or your program is relevant to that hypothesis. If it is a pathway that is upregulated and you need to be operating in that pathway, you can show that you're operating in that pathway, it is probably connected to tumor progression. And you may have a deal even if you've only done that in mice. Okay. Alternatively, if there's some cynicism about the animal model, you may need to take it into people. But the reality is because the unmet need has always been so clear and compelling, unlike the metaphorical observation that met where the need has been clear from the beginning. In the metaphor, what is suggested is very often the need isn't understood. So again, to your question, it's a great question, but oncology is almost not in there by design.
Okay, and I thank you for your questions. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Ed, for your presentation. And we'll wrap it up, and we'll follow up with the other several questions that we haven't answered today, some of which are going to make us need to go back and wade into the data and to answer your questions. So thank you all, and we will look forward to following up with you.